The term movie magic gets thrown around a lot in Hollywood, but have you ever stopped to think about what it actually means? In the earliest days of film, movies were a magic trick, a way to use light and chemistry to pull off the impossible illusion of, say, a train passing through a small theater full of people without hurting anyone. However, while special effects are a part of the formula, you usually hear movie magic when watching a montage of great films and their most memorable moments. So, to me, I guess movie magic is a term that encompasses the unique possibilities of film. When you put together all the myriad art forms that make up a movie, from the music to the photography, the storytelling to the acting, the costumes to the sound design, etc., what emerges is more than just the sum of its parts. It's something that can touch individual people on deep, emotional, almost spiritual levels, but can also have an easily underestimated impact on culture and society at large. It can entertain and it can enlighten. It can be an earnest call to action, or it can be a beautiful escape from the troubles of everyday life. And that, at long last, brings me to the subject of today's video, a film so fantastically powerful that it can only be described as movie magic. I'm going to forego the synopsis I'd usually place here, because not only do you already know Dorothy's story, but we have a lot of ground to cover. Prior to becoming the stuff of Hollywood legend, The Wizard of Oz was already a massive phenomenon as a series of young adult books. Starting at the turn of the last century, L. Frank Baum created the first 14 of what would eventually become 40 canonical Oz novels. Baum wanted to bring joy to children, because he found he had a knack for telling stories to the neighborhood kids, who would all gather around to hear them. He also wanted to create a distinctly American fairy tale, something akin to Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, but with an emphasis on American values and cultural hallmarks like Midwestern farming culture. That first novel, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, which was only published on the guarantee that it would be adapted into a stage musical, was an enormous success, and the musical, which premiered 2 years later in Chicago, made its way to Broadway and beyond. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was also adapted into a couple of silent films and an animated short, and in the 1930s, during the height of the Great Depression, Baum's novels were more popular than ever, bringing comfort to hundreds of thousands of children suffering through difficult times. Meanwhile, in Hollywood, Paramount Pictures was putting together a star-studded extravaganza of a film out of Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, and in the event that it became a success, the other studios started bidding on The Wizard of Oz, hoping to capitalize on a surge in fantasy films. By the time 1933's Alice in Wonderland bombed at the box office, MGM, which had plans to turn Oz into a Laurel and Hardy picture, lost the bidding war to Samuel Goldwyn, who had purchased the rights from Baum's estate for $40,000. However, with the financial failure of Alice in Wonderland, interest in making an Oz movie fell by the wayside. Oh, and if I may digress, just because it's always confused me, Samuel Goldwyn had nothing to do with the creation of MGM, despite the G standing for Goldwyn, a portmanteau of his original anglicized name, Goldfish, and Selwyn, the surname of 2 Broadway producers he partnered with to form Goldwyn Pictures. While he did have his name legally changed to the made-up Goldwyn, which, let's face it, does sound a lot better than Goldfish, he left his namesake production house before it was purchased by Marcus Lowe and merged with Metro Pictures and Louis B. Mayer Pictures to become Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. TLDR, Samuel Goldwyn was not connected to MGM. Anyway, now enter our story Arthur Freed, a musical lyricist working at MGM throughout the 1930s who had aspirations to produce. He had his mind set on adapting The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, And around the same time that Walt Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs proved that fantasy films could actually be profitable, Freed approached studio head Louis B. Mayer and convinced him to purchase the rights from Goldwyn and to peg another Oz aficionado, Mervyn LeRoy, to produce. With a lot of oversight from Freed himself, the script came together from the work of dozens of different writers, often toiling away in ignorance of each other's work. But the one who contributed the most to the final script was Noel Langley, with Florence Ryerson and Edgar Allan Wolfe brought in to align Langley's more grounded story with the fantasy of the original novel. As it was a musical, the script also incorporated the lyrics of Yip Harburg, which were written to the music of Harold Allen. As for the directors, there were quite a few of them as well. LeRoy wanted to direct the film himself, which was nixed by Mayer, and Norman Turog was considered before the job landed in the hands of MGM workhorse Richard Thorpe. However, after 2 weeks of filming and during some production troubles I'll discuss later, Thorpe was removed from the project and temporarily replaced by George Cukor, who quickly left to work on Gone with the Wind. Finally, with the film on the ropes, they brought in Victor Fleming, known as a competent fixer of troubled productions. Fleming, as a director known for more masculine films, seemed like an odd choice, but he had recently fathered 2 young daughters and wanted to make something that could appeal to them. Though Fleming directed the bulk of the film and received the sole credit for it, he also left before it was finished to work on Gone with the Wind, leaving the last bit of Oz and the Kansas sequences to be directed by King Vidor. The studio system moved fast. To play Dorothy, Arthur Freed always had in mind Judy Garland, who he'd worked with before on Broadway Melody of 1938. Garland was a rising star and contracted with MGM, but the studio considered a few other starlets before casting her, including Deanna Durbin. Most famously, they considered Shirley Temple, though she was contracted with Fox and didn't have the vocal range for Allen and Harburg's music. How seriously MGM actually took the idea of Shirley Temple is a subject of much debate, but suffice it to say, Freed got his wish and Garland got the part. Unfortunately for Garland, while the role would become her magnum opus, her experience was mired by various levels of abuse from cast and crew, the details of which I'd rather not relate here, and it is at least partially responsible for the permanent addiction to barbiturates and amphetamines that ultimately cost her her life a few decades later. For the titular wizard, they went through Ed Wynn, Wallace Beery, and W.C. Fields before casting MGM veteran Frank Morgan.
I am Oz!
Best known at the time for The Great Ziegfeld. To beef up the part, Morgan was given 6 different roles: the wizard, the man behind the curtain, the gatekeeper, the carriage driver, the palace guard, and Professor Marvel. According to legend, the coat he wears as Professor Marvel was found at a second-hand shop and by happenstance turned out to be originally owned by L. Frank Baum, though this is likely just a bit of Hollywood publicity mongering. The Wicked Witch of the West, meanwhile, is played by Margaret Hamilton, who got the part only days before the start of filming when the first choice, Gail Sondergaard, dropped out, deciding she didn't want to play an ugly character. Much of Hamilton's performance wound up on the cutting room floor, though, because test screenings showed that children were absolutely terrified of her. For this fiery effect, and indeed in the very take you see in the film, a timing error set Hamilton's costume and makeup alight, which gave her first and second degree burns that required a stint at hospital in the middle of filming. As for Dorothy's fantastic companions, Bert Lahr was hired to play the Cowardly Lion in what turned out to be a physically demanding role. The lion's suit was made from real lion skins, and under the intense lighting required for the Technicolor cameras, he was constantly overheated. He was also limited to a liquid diet while filming because his makeup precluded using anything but a straw to eat. However, as a professional vaudevillian, He was up to the challenge, lending his unique comedic instincts and singing style to the character, making him one of the most beloved parts of the film.
I haven't slept in weeks.
Why don't you try counting sheep?
That doesn't do any good. I'm afraid of them.
The Scarecrow was originally to be played by Buddy Ebsen, and the Tin Man was originally going to be Ray Bolger. However, Bolger, with his loose-limbed dancing style, had always wanted to play the Scarecrow, and went to producer Mervyn LeRoy to lobby to have his role switched with Ebsen's. Due to his stubbornness and Buddy Ebsen's nonchalant attitude about playing the Tin Man, the two actors were eventually switched. Unfortunately, 10 days into filming, Ebsen had to be hospitalized after repeatedly breathing in the aluminum powder they used to paint his face, and was forced to discontinue work on the film. As such, he was replaced by another veteran vaudevillian, Jack Haley, who was already friends with Burt Lahr and Ray Bolger. The makeup department then changed to aluminum paste with an undercoat of grease paint to ensure Haley didn't suffer the same fate as Ebsen. However, some of the aluminum paste did get in Haley's eye and cause a nasty infection that also required hospitalization, but it wasn't severe enough to cost him the part. For the Munchkins of Munchkinland, MGM brought in as many as 124 little people from across America and paid them a respectable $125 a week, roughly equivalent to $3,000 today. For many of them, it was their first experience seeing differently statured people like themselves, and they approached their parts with an enthusiasm that is abundantly apparent on screen, even if most of their lines were later redubbed.
I welcome you most regally, but we've got to verify it legally.
Not everybody in Munchkinland is a little person, though, as there are a few children in the background to fill things out. Other notable actors include Billy Burke as Glinda, Clara Bandick as Auntie M, and, last but not least, the prolific Cairn Terrier Terry as Toto. Filming began entirely on MGM soundstages in October of 1938. The early filming, with Richard Thorpe directing and Buddy Ebsen playing the Tin Man, had to be halted when Ebsen went to the hospital and when the rushes started coming in. Thorpe's style just didn't seem to mesh with the material, his footage was reportedly uninspired, and LeRoy had him fired. When Cooker was brought in as a temp director, he made changes to Dorothy's look and acting style, she was blonde and played it hammy in the Thorpe footage, and was the one to suggest Jack Haley as the replacement Tin Man. In addition to the medical complications, the makeup, done by Jack Dawn, was difficult to put together. Fearing the bad precedent set by Paramount's Alice in Wonderland, where the star actors are unrecognizable beneath their makeup, Dawn had to make sure the actors weren't hidden, but that the makeup blended well with the elaborate costumes, which were designed by Adrian Greenberg, credited mononymously as just Adrian. Adrian, in defiance of convention, designed all of the costumes in the movie, including the over 100 colorful felt outfits worn by the Munchkins, while Jack Dawn used an elaborate combination of conventional makeup, unconventional makeup, and foam rubber to blend the actors seamlessly into Adrian's designs. The makeup that always impresses me the most is the Scarecrow's, with its blended burlap textures. The special effects were supervised by Arnold Buddy Gillespie, whose two biggest challenges were creating the show-stopping Kansas Twister and working with Technicolor. For the former, he built the funnel out of muslin and steel, set each end on a separate moving gantry, and had Fuller's earth blown through it by powerful air compressors. This was then filmed alongside a miniature of the farmhouse and combined with actors on a set using rear projection. The Technicolor, on the other hand, was an entirely different proposition. In addition to requiring obscene amounts of lighting and a comically oversized camera rig, the use of double exposure in Technicolor, something the film relies on quite heavily, was mostly untested waters. The Wizard of Oz wasn't the first Technicolor feature film, but it was unquestionably the most ambitious, and Gillespie was therefore forced to become a pioneer in his field. The results speak for themselves. The original cut of the film was much too long, and a lot of severe edits had to be made, including the removal of many musical numbers. One scene that is conspicuous in its absence is the jitterbug scene, which is the payoff to the Wicked Witch's otherwise inexplicable line about sending an insect to slow down our heroes.
They'll give you no trouble, I promise you that. I've sent a little insect on ahead to take the fight out of them.
The studio even wanted to cut out Over the Rainbow, perhaps the most iconic song in the entire film and the one which would be married to Garland for all eternity. They thought it slowed down the movie just when it should be getting to Oz already, and they thought it uncouth to feature a musical number being sung by a pretty girl in a barnyard. Thankfully, Freed, ever protective of his vision, put his foot down and threatened to walk away from the project unless the song was kept in. Today, the National Endowment for the Arts calls Over the Rainbow the Song of the Century, and the American Film Institute considers it the greatest movie song of all time. The Wizard of Oz released to much fanfare in August of 1939, with New York screenings featuring live stage performances from Judy Garland, Mickey Rooney, Ray Bolger, and Burt Lahr. It went wide on August 25th, just 2 weeks before Germany invaded Poland, marking the official start of World War II. The film received universal acclaim from critics and audiences alike, and ultimately earned just over $3 million in its initial worldwide run. However, believe it or not, this was still over $1 million short of turning a profit, a reality that is often blamed on a multitude of factors including the lower ticket price for children, the looming war in Europe, and the exorbitant marketing campaign that preceded its release. Then again, this box office disappointment didn't stop the movie from becoming one of the biggest and most important films ever produced by the Hollywood studio system, right alongside MGM's other 1939 classic, Gone with the Wind. The careers of just about everybody involved became stratospheric. Arthur Freed wound up getting his own film division at MGM, literally called the Freed Unit, which specialized in musicals. Judy Garland got a huge pay raise and went from being a rising star to a bona fide super celebrity. Margaret Hamilton became a hot commodity. Over the Rainbow won Best Song at the Academy Awards, and Buddy Gillespie got his first nomination, leading to a very successful career, including 3 future Oscar wins in its wake. By the time CBS made it an annual television event in the mid-50s, The Wizard of Oz had already cemented its place in cinema history. But come on, you don't need me to tell you how big the movie became. It surpassed even the original book series to become a part of not just American culture, but of the collective unconscious of the entire world, becoming much bigger than just a movie and more akin to a Jungian archetype. We all know the story, we all know the songs, we all know the Scarecrow needs a brain, the Tin Man a heart, and the Lion some courage. Quotes from the film have become commonplace shorthand.
Toto, I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore.
And to this day, the entire entertainment industry still chases its success with Broadway musicals, sequels, spin-offs, and new iterations. It's one of the most famous and long-lasting American fairy tales ever produced. But do I like The Wizard of Oz? I mean, sure, I appreciate the filmmaking, the performances, and the overall legacy of the movie, and sure, I know most of the songs by heart just through cultural osmosis. But I'd be lying if I said it's a movie I watch all the time. I watched it a lot as a kid, like most everybody else, and I'll admit I may have synced it up to Pink Floyd's The Dark Side of the Moon while in college, but before I set out to make this video, I hadn't watched it from beginning to end in probably 30 years. From a story perspective, which is of course what I focus on this channel, its overt theme isn't exactly hard to figure out. There's no place like home. but there's gotta be more to it than that for it to be such a massive phenomenon. For one thing, that theme seems a bit agoraphobic. I've heard explanations that what Dorothy is really talking about when she talks about home is the love of her family, but I'm not sure there's enough evidence within the film to come to that conclusion. But even if we ignore that, the movie seems to carefully remove many of the socio-political allegories of the book, which is often interpreted as a bizarre treatise on American economics, with the yellow brick road representing the gold standard, the scarecrow representing the plight of farmers, and a lot of other stuff that sounds incredibly silly when you try to explain it. Personally, I interpret the movie more as a story about friendship. It should come as no surprise to you that I've always been a bit of a weird dude.
What?
And throughout my journeys in life, I've collected more than my fair share of other weirdos. Friends, I've come to learn, complement each other, make up for each other's deficits, and allow us to reach our fullest potentials. Just as the heartless Tin Man comes to learn through Dorothy and the gang that he had a heart all along, or that the cowardly lion discovers that true courage isn't about overcoming your fears so much as it is about doing the right thing even when you are afraid, friendship gives us powers we never knew we had. E pluribus unum, out of many, one.
E pluribus unum?
Now, of course, this can easily extend to our families. Given that the Oz characters all have real-life doppelgangers in Kansas, what Dorothy might be really learning is that her family is a support structure she can't survive without. Maybe, if you stretch this idea far enough, you might even be able to justify the home means family interpretation I blithely dismissed a minute ago. But hopefully, you get my point. And while I can forgive the "it was all a dream" ending because that was well telegraphed from the moment Dorothy bumped her head and doesn't actually detract from the core ideas of the story, I do not forgive one loose end: the fact that the inciting incident goes completely unresolved. After the credits roll, what is stopping the evil Miss Gulch from taking Toto away again? That's the whole reason Dorothy ran away in the first place and needed to be reminded of how important home is, and given how useless her family was in stopping Miss Gulch the first time, the only way I can see for Toto to escape the hangman's noose is if Miss Gulch was killed in the twister, not something we really see. I think it would be fun to see a scene where Dorothy throws a bucket of water on her, but maybe that's just me. But truthfully, that's just a nitpick. And as I often say here, there is a big difference between nitpicking and genuine criticism. I might be able to find a chink or two in its armor, but nothing I could possibly say could take away from how great The Wizard of Oz is. It may just be the greatest fantasy film ever made. And that's all for today, my fellow Earthlings. This was the first in a series of fantasy reviews I'm doing for the month of February, and I hope you enjoy it. Let me know what other fantasy films you think I should cover in the comments below, and while you're there, don't forget to smack those like and subscribe buttons. Thank you for watching, and until next time, when a little bit of luck will carry us far, this is the Unapologetic Geek telling you to never be ashamed of what you love. As long as you're not hurting anybody.
I gotta go, Julia. We got cows.